Bienvenue. Welcome to the garden of Claude Monet. It's in the French countryside, about 50 miles from Paris, and it's a garden the artist designed himself. Imagine standing on this bright turquoise bridge. What do you see looking down? Lily blossoms in creamy yellow, pink, and white, perhaps with frogs under them? Reeds and flowering plants around the edges of the pond, where birds might perch. Willow trees beyond. Your own reflection in the water. Study the reflections in the pond. Do you see how the surrounding green trees and plants create a mirror of themselves on the water? Can you find the double arch of the footbridge? Monet was fascinated by water and the ever-changing reflections on its surface. He insisted that his gardeners keep the pond very clean, even skimming and dusting its surface, so that reflections of clouds and sky, trees and shrubs would appear clearly. Monet loved his lily pond and made more than 200 paintings of it. He said,
"My garden is slow work pursued by love, and I do not deny that I am proud of it."
Born on November 14, 1840, Claude Monet was a 19th century French painter and one of the founding fathers of French Impressionism. Some consider him one of the most important painters of the Impressionist movement, and he was certainly one of the most prolific, creating more than 2,500 paintings, drawings, and pastels in his lifetime. Monet was the second son of his parents. Though he was born in Paris, France, his family moved to Normandy only a few years later. His father was a businessman, and his mother was a singer. Monet's father wanted him to go into the family's grocery business, but Monet wanted to become an artist. When he was only 10 years old, he entered the local art school and began his studies. By age 15, Monet was well known in the town where he lived for drawing caricatures, or exaggerated portraits, of the people around him. His drawings were so good that people were happy to buy them, and Monet attracted the attention of more experienced artists who helped him to improve. In 1857, Monet's mother died. Shortly afterward, he left school and went to live with his aunt. In 1861, Claude Monet joined the army for what was supposed to be 7 years, but after 2 years he became sick, and his aunt agreed to pay to get him out of the rest of his service on condition that he agreed to go back to art school. Monet was not happy with the traditional techniques that were being taught, and so after a very short time, he left the school and began to study with other artists who were trying to create in a new way. They painted outside, with quick brush strokes, more concerned with capturing the feeling of the color and the light than with accurate or realistic painting. This style of painting came to be called Impressionism. By 1865, some of Monet's work was accepted to the Salon, an annual art show in Paris, and his work began to be appreciated, but he was still very poor. He married his first wife, Camille, in 1870, and together with their young son, they moved first to England, then the Netherlands, but by late 1871, they returned to France. In 1878, Camille gave birth to their second son, but she was very sick and died the next year. Monet had a very difficult time following his wife's death, but within a few years his career began to take off as his dealer had more and more success selling his paintings. In 1883, Monet settled in a house in Giverny, France, with Alice Ochday, who cared for his children as well as her own 6 children. By 1890, Monet was doing well enough to buy the house and the land around it, and to build a greenhouse, a studio, and a garden full of water lilies. In 1892, following the death of her husband, Monet married Alice and spent his remaining years painting the gardens of Giverny. He often painted the same thing many times in an attempt to capture them in different seasons, light, or colors. He continued painting up until his death on December 5th, 1926.
We say all the time that artists see the world differently. Monet's friend and fellow painter Paul Cézanne once said, "But what an eye Monet has." And he was right. Monet did have a special eye, literally. Later in life, he developed cataracts and the lenses of his eyes became yellow and cloudy. To an artist like Monet, color was everything, but his artistic lens was broken. Normal human eyes have 3 types of cone cells that are roughly sensitive to blue, green, and red light. But because their sensitivities overlap, and because we evolved to be active in the daylight, our eyes are most sensitive to yellow light. Because Monet's cataracts were yellow, they acted like a color subtracting filter, taking away even more blue and red light and enhancing the yellowness of everything, especially his paints. Paint pigments work by absorbing some wavelengths of light and reflecting others. One of Monet's favorite blues, French aquamarine, has a reflectance that looks like this, but his cataracts would have acted like a color subtracting filter, taking away those blues and reds, and leaving the scene and his paints muted and yellow. We can see this in Monet's paintings because he painted the same scene at different times in his life. The effects of his cataracts are clear, or not clear. Computer simulations of Monet's impaired vision show that paintings that are completely different to us would have been indistinguishable to him. He might have been just throwing paint on the canvas or painting from memory, but the worst part is he knew that he couldn't see the world as he used to, and it must have been devastating for him. Eventually his cataracts got so bad that in 1923, he decided to have the lens removed from his right eye, and that's when he became a bee. Or half of a bee. And we talked before how honeybees are sensitive to ultraviolet light and how the world looks completely different to them because they can see wavelengths that we simply can't see. Humans with normal vision can't see light shorter than about 390 nanometers, but our blue cone cells are sensitive down to 300 nanometers, down into the ultraviolet range. So why can't we see ultraviolet light? It's actually your eye's lens that filters out that ultraviolet light, and without his, Claude Monet could see a bit like a honeybee, at least on his right side. His blues would have been bluer, his violets violeter, and his whites, we can't even imagine what those would look like, but luckily Monet tried to show us. Around 1924, he painted the same scene behind his house twice, once with each eye shut. Through his cataract-clouded left eye, the world is muddy, red, and yellow. But through his lensless right eye, it's brilliant blue and violet. Sadly, Monet never got quite used to that new superpower. He destroyed many of his later works, and he died just a few years after having that cataract removed.
Little wee, birds in the trees seem to la 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 la, ooh la la.